and created cartels of businesses in every major industry that, instead of market forces, decided how much products would cost, how much workers would make, and how much companies would produce. These cartels were called code authorities. In Italy, they were called cooperatives. In Germany, they were known as industrial cartels. But in all three nations they held the same powers, and in all three nations they could be overruled only by the head of state: Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and Roosevelt in the United States. How could such a radical party come about in the United States? Many of the men who conceived of the NIRA were opposed to free markets, disdainful of democracy, and committed to a centrally controlled economy. The architects of the early New Deal had their roots in progressivism and shared that movement's obsession with social order, discipline, rationality, and the merging of the individual's identity with the nation. These obsessions were a transatlantic phenomenon in the first half of the 20th century, but they were particularly powerful in the United States, Italy, and Germany. According to historian John P. Diggins, whose 1972 book, Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America, was the first academic acknowledgement of fascist sympathies among American elites. Mussolini's fascist dictatorship drew more admiration from democratic America than from any other Western nation. Many leading American intellectuals and political figures from the progressive generation were drawn to fascism in the 1920s. The famous progressive muckrakers, Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell, visited Italy and wrote glowing accounts of the black-shirt regime. One of the most enthusiastic supporters of both the early New Deal and Italian fascism was Charles Beard, a Columbia University professor and the leading member of the School of Progressive Historians. In an article in the New Republic magazine, Beard argued that Americans should look past Mussolini's use of violence and suppression of civil liberties and recognize that fascism was the most effective modernizing force in the world. It is an amazing experiment, an experiment in reconciling individualism and socialism, politics and technology. It would be a mistake to allow feelings aroused by contemplating the harsh deeds and extravagant assertions that have accompanied the fascist process to obscure the potentialities and the lessons of the adventure, no, not adventure, but destiny riding without any saddle and bridle across the historic peninsula that bridges the world of antiquity and our modern world. Beard, like many former progressives who supported the New Deal, was especially enthusiastic about the corporatist economic model introduced by Mussolini. Another group that was overwhelmingly supportive of Italian fascism was American big business, which praised Mussolini for bringing order and stability to the Italian economy. The president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Julius Barnes, repeatedly declared in speeches and magazine articles that Mussolini is without question a great man. James Emery of the National Association of Manufacturers praised Il Duce at a NAM convention for leading through the streets of a reunited country a great body of citizens, who rescued Italy from the blighting hand of radical socialism. Referring to the American economy, the Wall Street Journal titled an editorial, "Needed, a Mussolini." Thomas W. Lamont, head of the J.P. Morgan banking network, called himself a missionary for fascism and devoted himself to quiet preaching on its behalf. According to Diggins, with few exceptions, the dominant voices of business responded to fascism with hearty enthusiasm. Many of these businessmen later directed their firms to donate money to the Nazi Party. One of those businessmen was Gerard Swope, the chairman of General Electric, who also wrote the first draft of the NIRA. In 1931, Swope published what he called the Swope Plan, which argued that antitrust laws had to be suspended so that companies in a given industry could free themselves from market forces and collectively determine prices, wages, and production levels. Running through Swope's argument, as in the arguments of many New Dealers, was a hostility toward democracy. "Shall we wait for society to act through its legislatures?" he asked. "Or shall industry recognize its obligation to its employees and to the public and undertake the task?" His answer was to replace the U.S. Congress with the corporate cartels. Organized industry should take the lead, recognizing its responsibility to its employees, to the public, and to its stockholders, rather than that democratic society should act through its government. Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, called the Swope Plan a prescription for fascism. That prescription was filled in the first month of Roosevelt's presidency, when, according to Leon Kaiserling, one of the principal authors of the NIRA, the original draft of the act grew out of the so-called Gerard Swope Plan for recovery. The men who made the New Deal were driven by dreams of a machine-like society in which all members, from the leaders of government to the lowliest of workers, would be parts designed, built, and employed entirely for their function within the whole apparatus. But to their dismay, these men found that most Americans rejected such dreams, except during times of crisis. The First World War was the first such crisis, and they embraced the opportunity to discipline America. But then came the peace and prosperity of the 20s, a long time of waiting for another national emergency that could make their fantasies of social order come true. Social machinery. In the 1920s, the offices in the buildings along the eastern edge of the Columbia University campus looked from the hills of Morningside Heights out over Harlem. Rexford Tugwell, a professor in the economics department, occupied one of those offices. From behind his desk in Hamilton Hall, Tugwell could not hear the music, but he could see the nightclubs, dance halls, and speakeasies that defined the jazz age. And so, he waited. Tugwell had been shut off from the pleasures of the body as a child, when asthma and persistent illnesses kept him confined to bed in his rural and isolated hometown in far western New York State. He grew into an extraordinary handsome man, with the dark looks and wavy hair of a silent screen star. But his illnesses continued, and by the time he reached maturity, he had retreated into a world of books. He was a fan of utopian science fiction, such as H.G. Wells's In the Days of the Comet, in which mankind, fearing destruction from an onrushing comet, remakes world society into a cooperative commune. Tugwell spent much of his youth conjuring perfect worlds inhabited by perfect people. As an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1910s, he fell under the spell of the young economics professor Scott Nearing, who had recently published a book calling for the creation of just such a world. The kind of social philosophy I was developing under the tutelage of Nearing, reinforced by other instruction, Tugwell later recalled in his autobiography, is perhaps best defined in a little book called The Super Race, An American Problem, which Nearing published in 1912. Nearing argued that the United States should develop, through selective breeding, a race of supermen who would create the world's first utopia. These ideas, which were bastardized versions of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, were then in vogue among German intellectuals who would become the intellectual founders of Nazism. Tugwell's other mentor in college was the prominent progressive economist Simon Patton, who had been trained in German universities. He taught me the importance of looking for uniformities, laws, explanations of the inner forces moving behind the facade of events, Tugwell remembered. One of these was the conclusion that our pluralistic system, laissez-faire in industry, checks and balances in government, and so on, must be shaped into a unity if its inherent conflicts, beginning to be so serious, were not to destroy us. From where did Patton get this benign-sounding idea? He thought that the Germans had the key to that unity in philosophy, in economics, and perhaps in politics. He saw the conflict, now so ominously coming up over the horizon, as one between the living wholeness of the German conception and the dying divisiveness of English pluralism. Even more ominous was the belief that Patton shared with his German colleagues who would supply the intellectual basis for Nazism, that industrial capitalism and technological advances had softened and emasculated the people. Every improvement which simplifies or lessens manual labor, explained Patton, increases the amount of the deficiencies which the laboring classes may possess without their being thereby overcome in the struggles for subsistence that the survival of the ignorant brings upon society. Patton's solution to this problem was swift, simple, and breathtakingly ruthless. Social progress is a higher law than equality, and a nation must choose it at any cost. And the only way to progress is the eradication of the vicious and inefficient. But the prescriptions of Nearing and Patton were just academic wishes. Tugwell wished to make them real. The World War was a godsend. When America entered the European conflict in 1917, Tugwell, like many progressives, saw it as a chance to create an industrial engineer's utopia. The government agencies that seized control of major industries and directed the national economy from Washington, the campaigns against vice to maintain the country's discipline and racial vigor, and the creation of 5 million regimented, physically fit men through the draft, filled Tugwell with hope. "We are on the verge of having an international industrial machine," he later remembered. But peace dashed his dreams. Only the armistice prevented a great experiment in control of production, control of price, and control of consumption. Through the 1920s, Tugwell looked wistfully out the window of his Columbia office and wrote a series of articles calling for a return to a wartime society, when social control and the scientific management of human life would be the order of the day. The stock market crash of 1929 provided his next opportunity. In the early years of the Great Depression, Tugwell wrote a book that he thought America, now in its most desperate hour, could finally take seriously. The Industrial Discipline and the Government Arts argued for making all of society into a great factory. The book called for removing the dead hand of competitive enterprise and replacing it with central planning. When industry is government and government is industry, the dual conflict deep in our modern institutions will have abated, he said. Naturally, he admired the Italian government for their doing just this. Mussolini, he said, had done many of the things which seemed to me necessary. And at any rate, Italy is being rebuilt physically in a systematic way. On a frigid winter day in 1932, while walking down the street near his office, huddled in his tweed jacket and overcoat, Tugwell encountered a colleague from the political science department named Raymond Moley. Moley asked if he would like to meet Franklin Roosevelt, then the governor of New York and a candidate for the presidency, to discuss joining Roosevelt's team of advisors. Tugwell, thrilled, accepted the offer, and within a few weeks he was a member of the famous Brains Trust, a small group of academics who built the New Deal. Tugwell would conceive and craft several major initiatives of the New Deal, including the NIRA, the Public Works Program, and many of Roosevelt's agricultural projects. But soon after he started his new job in Washington, Tugwell began to envy his hero in Rome. "Mussolini certainly has the same people opposed to him as FDR has," Tugwell later said. "But he has the press controlled, so they cannot scream lies at him daily, and he has a compact and disciplined nation, although it lacks resources. On the surface, at least, he seems to have made enormous progress. Democracy was the problem, and fascism was the cleanest, neatest, most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious." While Tugwell came to his love for regimentation through the life of the rationalistic mind, General Hugh Johnson came to his through another major source of New Deal culture: the military. With a round Irish face reddened by alcoholism, Johnson looked and drank like W.C. Fields, but he did not share the comedian's individualism and irreverence toward authority. As a teenager in the Wild West town of Alva,